Sure, sure. Good evening. I call this meeting of the West Hollywood Rent Stabilization Commission to order. Please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Amen. Moving on to item 3 of our agenda. Commissioners, please ensure that you have your mics on and phones set to silent, including the audience. Please make sure you have your phone set to silent. Secretary Barino, may we have a roll call?
Yes. Commissioner Kerpes? Commissioner Bergstein?
Here.
Commissioner O'Keefe?
Here.
Commissioner Maggio?
Present.
Commissioner Topchian?
Here.
Commissioner Gregoire?
Here.
And Chair Charity.
Here. Thank you very much. Moving on to item 4 of our agenda, the approval of the agenda. Commissioners, having reviewed tonight's agenda, do you have any changes or a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to approve this evening's agenda.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Thank you. Note we have one abstention with Commissioner Kerpes. Thanks. Moving on to item 5, approval of the minutes of our September 13th meeting. Commissioners, having reviewed the minutes of our prior meeting, do you have any changes to the minutes or a motion to approve?
Correction, just that I believe that Commissioner Topchian came a little bit later in the evening, was not present at roll call.
Thank you. We'll note that change.
Was
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the change.
which
Sure, the change was Commissioner Topchian wasn't present for the roll call at the September 13th meeting and arrived just a bit later.
Thank you.
is that noted in the minutes somewhere?
Commissioner Bergstein, do you see this?
Not currently noted in the minutes.
Is there a need to note that in the minutes?
Usually, if the commissioner is present at some point, that
Yeah.
all is usually needed. But
What we have typically done, they will appear above as present at the meeting. We'll make a note where they join the meeting, and that's following what other boards and commissions do. So we'll add that in so you can go ahead and approve them as amended.
Thank you. Are there any further changes, or do we have a motion to approve the prior minutes as amended?
I had a question about them. I wasn't present, but at the end of commissioner comments, or at the end of the first paragraph of commissioner comments, it says the money that West Hollywood is providing will go towards the 13 units. And maybe I missed something, but I'm not seeing a prior reference to 13 units. So I'm wondering if it should say 13 of the units, or if something else was supposed to say 13 previously. I guess that was Commissioner Maggio. That was you that provided the report. So perhaps you know. It says the money that West Hollywood is providing will go towards the 13 units. And I just wasn't sure.
yes, West Hollywood's housing fund will provide for only 13 of those units that I reported on.
Okay, so maybe I should say towards 13 of the units. It's very small, but that might be clear.
Did the amount of $2.5 million, which I think was mentioned, or?
It says 2.1 in the notes. Are you changing that to 2.5, Commissioner Maggio?
No, 2.1 is what the report, I reported.
Okay, so we have the addition of, Commissioner Topchian's arrival to the meeting, and then the little caret there of the 13 units.
Or 13 of the units.
13 of the units, yes, 13 of the units.
Move to approve as
Amended.
amended. Thank you. Sorry.
No worries. Do we have a second?
I second them.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed?
I think I have to abstain because I wasn't there.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much. We do have a public comment this evening in item 6 of our agenda. I do have one public comment, Esther Schiller. Good evening, Esther.
Good evening.
You'll have 3 minutes to speak. Please make sure you speak directly into the microphone so you can be heard. And please state your name and city of residence. You can bend it down as much as you may need.
I
Okay,
did.
great. Thank you.
Good evening, Chairperson Charity, members of the commission and staff. My name is Esther Schiller. I'm director of the nonprofit organization Smoke Free Air for Everyone. Beginning in the year 2000 and for the next 15 years, our organization had funding from the California Department of Public Health to provide information to tenants, condo owners, HOAs, landlords, and policymakers about the benefits of smoke-free policies in multi-unit housing. And some months ago, this commission brought the same concern about the same issue to the City Council. The mayor at that time, now Councilmember John Heilman, requested that staff research the issue and bring the information back to the City Council. I'm here this evening to share with you what some stakeholders have been up to in the weeks since then. The stakeholders include the American Cancer Society, the American Lung Association, the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health's Tobacco Control and Prevention Program, and our organization, and several others. Staff of these organizations have met with 3 members of the City Council and hope to meet with the other 2 members in the future. Our goal for these meetings has been to provide the most updated information available to us on the problem of secondhand smoke, secondhand marijuana smoke, and vaping. For example, it's not common knowledge, but it should be, that marijuana smoke is a carcinogen according to the state of California. It was placed on the Prop 65 list of known carcinogens in June 2009 because it contains 33 of the same dangerous chemicals in tobacco smoke. We're also providing information about third-hand smoke. Several documents about third-hand smoke are in the packets that I've brought this evening, including an article for landlords, which I'm hoping that will be published in the magazine of the Apartment Association Greater LA in coming months. Scientists are telling us that third-hand smoke is probably more dangerous than second-hand smoke. When smoking occurs in a unit or when smoke infiltrates into a unit, some of the chemicals stick to walls, floors, furniture, and even clothing, skin, and hair. And this is called third-hand smoke. It accumulates over time. It re-emits or outgasses back into the environment even when no one is smoking. It combines with common chemicals found in the home and becomes more dangerous with those combinations and becomes more dangerous over time. Scientists are also telling us that it is almost impossible to remove. The longer there's smoking in a unit or smoke drifting into a unit, the more dangerous the problem becomes. This probably has some special concern for cities with rent control laws. I hope that you'll have the opportunity to review the documents I've provided, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Ms. Schiller.
If you can, I can't comment on what you've just said, but I was going to make a comment during commission comments, which are 2 agenda items up. So hang on a few minutes. You might want to hear what I'm going to.
I'm sorry, Mr. Bergstein, can you repeat that?
Yes, I can't comment on your public comment, but if you could hang on just a few minutes until commissioner comments, I'd actually brought something with me sort of pertaining to that. So
Very good, thank you.
Did the lady have some reading material for us, she said?
Yes, Commissioners, we do have it with our staff, and they're going to provide it to us and distribute it to us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Moving on to item 7, our Director Manager's Report. Mr. Noonan, may we have the Director Manager's Report?
Yes. So looking ahead at the next 3 meetings, we do have appeals scheduled on the October 11th meeting, the October 25th meeting, and the November 8th meeting. We do have shown here your, of course, Thanksgiving is never held. A meeting's not held. That's included in the bylaws. We do show that the December 27th meeting is canceled. You did approve your priorities at the last session, and we are aware of those, and we're working towards some of those items. And so, as appropriate, and as our time and as we are able to, we'll bring forward one of those pieces. I'm interested in bringing a discussion on harassment. I cannot promise that that will come in October or November, but ideally I would like to see if we couldn't bring that discussion item forward this year, since I think that that's been out there on the commissioners' minds for a while. Regarding the handouts that the public speaker had, we will go ahead and scan those in and provide those to you in an email so that you have those to read. That's my report.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Well, I seem to recall, did we have a discussion about canceling a meeting in either January or February?
I'm not certain if you had discussed that. It's certainly possible. I don't think that we've had the look ahead out to the next calendar year yet, but
Yeah, I
certainly
thought
the
there,
commission
I
could
thought
have
there
that
was some
conversation.
event that the city had there was a conflict on the calendar or something, so we,
I will look back
double
in the
check,
notes.
please.
Commissioners, do you have any further questions or comments for staff before moving on? No. Okay, we'll be moving on from item 7 to item 8, commission comments.
I don't know if the camera can zoom in on this or not, but this is a full-page ad from the Wall Street Journal from 2 days ago. It's on letterhead from Philip Morris International, in quotation marks, "I'm committed to a smoke-free future and a conversation about how to achieve it together," signed by, I'm going to butcher his name, Andrei Kalantzopoulos, CEO of Philip Morris International, stating over 1 billion people smoke. They are our friends, families, and loved ones. They deserve solutions. Most importantly, those who don't quit deserve better alternatives to cigarettes. We've dedicated 400 scientists and engineers and close to $5 billion to achieve this, but technology and science are not enough. We invite leaders, policymakers, scientists, health professionals, and everyone else to join the conversation on making a smoke-free future reality for these billion people. So I'm not sure I totally believe the CEO of a company that makes most of their money off of tobacco product, but I thought it was an interesting ad and timely. I believe that the city councils has agendized the potential for smoke-free housing sometime in October. Staff will be doing a report. I'm looking to Mr. Noonan. Do you recall or not?
I was going to save that for my comments at the end, but I believe that I did see that. I'd say it's a little premature to
Okay.
say that it's firm. However, I do see that on the calendar. It's the Code Compliance Office that's leading that report, and I did see it either for October or November.
Okay.
I would encourage you to just look at the agendas. I will certainly keep you up to date, since that was one of the commission's items going forward. But I would not want to confirm a specific date at this time.
So anybody who might be interested in attending that council meeting, you can always check the city's calendar. City's website is weho.org, and there's a calendar tab. I think right-hand side brings up all the future meetings and the agendas for those. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Bergstein. Any further commission comments?
Not at this time.
At this time, we'll be moving on from item 8 to item 9, our appeal this evening, D-4332. The address is 1000 North Palm Avenue, Unit 16. The appeal was filed by Carolyn David. Miss David, are you present? Thank you. The tenant is Miss Bridget Baker. Miss Baker, are you present? Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I will recuse myself from 1000 Palm Avenue because of a financial interest.
Thank you, Commissioner. Please note, the Commissioner has recused himself from this appeal. At this time, we'll have our staff report from our legal counsel, Ms. Allison Regan.
Thank you. The hearing examiner awarded a rent reduction to Bridget Baker of $110 for the removal of a parking space, and also found that the landlord had retained rent in excess of the MAR in the amount of $6,695.32. The landlord has appealed and argues that the current lease does not provide for parking, so therefore there was no elimination of a housing service. She also argues that the MAR was wrongly decided. Staff recommends that the Commission affirm the hearing examiner's decision. There is substantial evidence in the record supporting it, and the findings that on-site covered parking was a housing service provided by the landlord at the outset of the tenancy, and that it has since been eliminated without the required corresponding reduction in rent. In addition, there is substantial evidence for the findings regarding the MAR. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, do you have any questions for our counsel before we move on?
A quick one, Chair. In the summary of evidence and analysis, there is mentioning that there was a parking diagram submitted. It's not part of the package. I just want to know if it's dated.
If the diagram is dated,
Yeah, and if there is a copy, if we could see it.
I'll see if I can find it.
Yeah, thank you.
Any further comments or questions for staff?
Questions for staff. One, I think is probably just a brief clarification, but on page 33 of our packet is the table of the rent paid and the overcharges. For 11/20/16, it says excess of MAR 1 multiplied by 160 months. I'm assuming that's supposed to be $160 for 1 month, and just input error on that table.
Oh, I see. So this number should be switched.
Yep,
Yes,
okay.
correct.
And then, this is kind of a long question, but short question, but long entry. On page 34 of our packet, it says, and I'm doing quotations, David wanted to see a new start for tenancy following flood with parameters including the tenant pay for damage, stop harassing the neighbors, take better care of their unit, and give up parking space as they didn't have a car. She had many good reasons for wanting a new lease from difficult tenants, as evidenced by the complaints of other tenants, calls for police service, and damage to the unit. On page 35, David testified that it's not unusual for her to ask a tenant to sign a new lease when there is a significant change. On page 36, according to David, she had good cause to obtain a new lease from the tenants that excluded a parking space. So my short question to staff is, my understanding is that a landlord cannot require a tenant to sign a new lease with any material changes aside from an adjustment in rent from the AGA.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And then second question is, the MAR determination was that the MAR is $700 minus the $110 currently for the parking space that has been removed. I don't see an issue in our packets. You can tell me it's not germane if the tenant has paid in excess of that $590 since the hearing examiner made her decision.
That is not germane.
Okay. And then last question, if we do move to affirm the hearing examiner's decision and the landlord wants to comply with and return a parking space, does it have to be the parking space that is notated in the lease, or can it just be a like-for-like parking space?
That's not something that we can discuss
Okay.
here. That would have to be in a compliance determination.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
I'm sorry, but I had a little bit of trouble hearing Commissioner Topchin, so this might be repetitive of what he said. On the summary on page 1 and the resolution, it says there's substantial evidence on the record supporting the finding that on-site covered parking was a housing service. It says on page 37 of the packet that it is uncovered. And maybe I'm misreading it, but it looks like it's saying on page 1 of the summary that it's covered when it was actually uncovered. I mean, the resolution, page 1 of the resolution, the summary says on-site covered parking.
And on-site uncovered, unsecured, testified that the parking lot is uncovered and secured, correct? So the parking is on-site and uncovered, and that's where the hearing examiner got the 110. Mhm. Correct.
So I think we need to just change the resolution if we were to adopt it, right, to say uncovered?
Sure.
Okay. Or secured could be added. All right, that's all I have.
Okay. Do we have any further commission comments or questions for staff before moving on? Okay, so at this time, we'll hear from the parties. I realize the appealing party may have two parties, Carolyn David and David Watchell. Are you both present and would like to speak, or will just one party be speaking?
I'll be speaking on behalf of, it's actually Watchtown David 3 is the entity.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Well, okay, I'll explain these rules briefly to both parties. Each of you have 5 minutes to speak this evening. The appealing party has an opportunity to speak first and then also last after the tenant in rebuttal. However, you have 5 total minutes to speak. So before you speak, if you would let us know if you would like to divide your time or have them take track of your time in the beginning so you can have some time in the remainder to speak. Both parties, please remember to speak directly into the microphone so we can hear you. When you begin speaking, please state your name and city of residence, and they'll begin timing you. And we can first hear from the appealing party.
Thank you, Chair, Commissioners. My name is Jeffrey David from Irvine, California. I'd like to reserve approximately 90 seconds for rebuttal afterwards. I think there are only very few facts here that are relevant for this appeal. The first is that in 2001, the tenant and the landlord signed a lease for $700 per month with a unassigned parking space when available. In 2012, a new lease was signed. The 2001 lease is missing. No one has a copy of it. The 2012 lease assigned a monthly rent of $833 and gave an assigned parking space. At the time of the mediators conference, we had been under the impression that the lease the tenant had was incorrect, that there was no assigned parking spot. We have since learned that the lease that we had was the product of a dishonest property manager who has been let go in the interim. And we now understand that the lease that the tenant had in 2012 controls and that she does have an assigned parking space. So there actually is no reduction of services present in this dispute. And at this point, the appeal is fairly simple in that the mediator tried to have it both ways. She wanted to set the MAR at the 2001 lease level, but assign a parking space as if the 2012 lease applied. And all we ask this body is to make sure that there's some consistency here. And if we're going to reset the MAR to 2001, that we also say that the unassigned parking space, when available, remains in effect as the benefit. And if we want to assign the parking space, which we are fine to do, that we reset the MAR to the 2012 level. Now, our proposal is that we use the 2012 lease, and we want to do that for a few reasons. One, so they have the assigned spot. Two, so that everyone has a copy of the lease, because there is no 2001 copy. And three, because we think that's the most fair thing to do, that they have the lease that they presented to the mediator as being operative, and we want to adopt that lease as the operative lease. Now, we have a rent registration form with us that we're just waiting for your instruction on how to fill out. If you decide that the 2012 lease should not be operative, then we can reset the MAR to the 2001 level, but we ask that, as opposed to what the mediator said, that the rent re-registration be filled out with the original lease, which is that she still have the same unassigned spot when available. In either situation, there's been no reduction of services, and we think that, again, that the 2012 lease should be adopted. Thank you.
Commissioners, do you have questions for our speaker?
I have one. So you said that there was an unassigned parking spot when the tenancy began in 2001, and that meant that none of the spots were assigned. There were more people with cars than there were spots, and people would just use a spot if it's available. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, yes. I don't know. I can't say for sure if during that entire time there were more cars than spots. Maybe at times there weren't, but generally speaking, yes.
And how many assigned spots are there now? Are all of the spots assigned, or are there some unassigned and some assigned?
Almost all of the spots are now assigned.
You say almost all. How many are not?
I believe there remains one unassigned at the moment.
Thank you.
I'm trying to mesh two things that you said. You said in the beginning that there really is no issue with the parking because you recognize that there was a parking space assigned in the 2012 lease. But then later you said we have no problem reassigning the tenant a spot. So my question to you is, those don't mesh with me when you're saying that you recognize that the tenant was assigned a spot in the lease, and then you're saying you have no problem now assigning the tenant a parking spot.
Sure. We can square that by filling in a few blanks. The tenant does not have a car and has not actually had to use the spot. So during most of this time, we've been on the impression that it was not assigned. So yes, it now currently is assigned. It's never been used, so it's never really kind of been presented to us that this issue existed. Point of fact, we think that there's been some sort of bartering of the spot. Nothing comes to us about what's going on with it, really. But I think the basic answer to your question is we didn't know it was assigned, and she didn't have a car for it to really become an issue that it
That's what I thought. Thank you. Commissioners, any further comment before we move on? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
At this time, we'll hear from the tenant, Ms. Baker. As a gentle reminder, Ms. Baker, please state your name, city of residence, and please do speak directly into the mic so we can hear you.
My name is Bridget Baker. I live in West Hollywood.
Thank you.
Okay. My husband and I have been living at 1000 Palm Avenue in West Hollywood since January 1st, 2001. On April 13th, 2018, I applied for a hearing for two simple reasons. Reason one, maximum allowable rent. After nearly 18 years of paying rent with all of the subsequent increases, no accurate re-registration of our tenancy has ever been received by the city of West Hollywood. Therefore, the hearing examiner has correctly calculated the overcharges based on our initial rent. Reason number two, parking. Our parking space is no longer available to us, but it is still in our lease and we are still paying for it. In her appeal, Carolyn has stated that we never had assigned parking. The hearing examiner has proven otherwise. Carolyn also said that we signed our parking away on a 2012 lease. That never happened. She goes on to say that we bartered it away in 2016. In 2016, we were offered, but never actually accepted, the use of our neighbor's truck in exchange for the use of our parking space. How can this be construed as bartering when we haven't received anything in return? And this neighbor moved out last year. Carolyn also claims that I never knew my space had allegedly been taken away. I would not have applied for a rent decrease for loss of parking if I hadn't lost my parking. Finally, she adds that we signed a new lease with the benefit of assigned parking. Not true. Parking space M was assigned to us prior to the signing of the 2012 lease, as is shown by the maps of assigned parking given to every tenant at 1000 Palm Avenue in 2011. The 2012 lease merely shows which parking space was already ours when we signed it. The hearing examiner has stated that the value of our lost parking is a $110 rent decrease. No amount of arguing will change the fact that we have been overcharged for rent and that we are legally entitled to a rent reduction if our parking space is not returned to us. The law is pretty straightforward. I hope Commission will agree with staff and uphold the hearing examiner's decision. Thank you.
Commissioners, do you have any questions for Ms. Baker?
Yes. Do you maintain that you had assigned parking from the date that you moved in or sometime after you moved in prior to 2000?
In 2011, everyone who lived in the building that had cars was given an assigned parking space.
I'm sorry, would you mind repeating?
In 2011, everyone that lived in the building that had a car was assigned a parking space.
Okay, so from 2001 to 2011, it was unassigned. It was first come, first serve?
Right.
Thank you.
Commissioners, any further questions?
When you were asked not to park, not to use the parking space, or that you don't have a parking space, was it in a form of a letter or the notice given, 30-day notice?
No.
There was nothing from?
No, it was just given to another tenant.
Okay, it was just verbally you were told that you're not to park there anymore?
No, there are 2 motorcycles parked there. We have no access to it.
Okay.
Commissioners, anything further?
I do not.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our appealing party, I believe, has 90 seconds remaining in rebuttal. Oh, one moment. Do we have a handout you'd like us to see?
Oh,
That's a,
am I
that's a
supposed to pass
parking
this?
diagram.
Sorry, I was listening to her response at the same time.
Just one
I'm
moment,
just going
please.
to stand here until you
Thank you very much.
That's the 2011 notice she referenced about the assignment.
Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, we can continue, and we'll start timing whenever you begin speaking.
Thank you. I just want to address a few points raised by Bridget. In 2011, she stated that the parking spots were assigned to all the tenants that had cars. First, that was a mistake. There was a correction issued approximately 3 months later. I believe it's part of the Exhibit 7 to the mediator's statement. I don't think it's part of the packet, unfortunately. But even then, she said it assigned to people who had cars. And I want to emphasize that she did not have a car. And that's also important in terms of evaluating how much that rent should be reduced, to the extent that this commission feels that rent should be reduced. Again, we're not arguing now that she doesn't have the spot, but to the extent that her rent should be reduced because she doesn't have a spot that we say she does. The regulations require that the reduction contemplate what was actually reduced in terms of the services of the tenant, and that's a relative inquiry for every tenant. The tenant in this case never used the spot. She did not have a car. Therefore, she experienced no actual reduction in services. And again, this is all if the commission decides that she no longer has a spot. And again, I want to emphasize that we're no longer contending that.
Thank you. Commissioners, any further questions? Sure.
One question to make sure I understand. So you're saying that she has a parking spot now, but our record says, and according to the hearing examiner, on the date of the hearing the date of the hearing, she did not have or your contention was that she did not have a parking spot that day based upon some confusion internally.
Yes, the tenant, or the landlord, the property manager at the time gave different
I just want to make sure
executed
that I understand
leases.
that the evidence here that the hearing examiner reviewed was that the belief, your contention at that time that she did not have a parking spot, it was never assigned one, or, I don't want to go too into the details, but the hearing examiner based her decision on her not having the parking spot that day,
Correct.
although you may have corrected it since then. Okay,
Yes, and also that there was never a car to not
I
park.
understand that. Thank you.
But Commissioner Kurbis, I do want to clarify that point. I don't believe the tenant has a parking spot today. I believe the appealing party recognizes that can be assigned a parking spot today, but I don't believe she's assigned a parking spot currently at that residence. Is that my correct understanding? That you concede, let me just ask you this.
Sure.
Physically at the residence today, does Miss Baker have a parking spot that she can pull into that is her assigned parking spot?
No.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Nothing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At this time, we move on to commissioner deliberation. If any commissioners would like to start, Commissioner O'Keefe.
Before I start my thinking, I have a question for our council. If a tenant was assigned a housing service, had a service when they started, if her lease was unassigned, which I believe is spot was unassigned, which I believe is undisputed, and then for a brief period of time, for a few months, she had an assigned spot, is that considered the housing service when for a few months in the middle of the lease it's assigned?
No, so the testimony was, it may have been unassigned, but she had a space. There was no testimony that she couldn't find parking, so she had the parking housing service from the beginning of her tenancy.
Okay. So it sounds to me like there's no question that the original lease should control, even though it doesn't exist. It's not, our council tells us that you can't have a new lease with the same tenants except to adjust the MAR for the annual adjustment. So I think that for purposes of the MAR, that the 2001 lease would qualify and that all of that would be due. The 2012 lease does not trump. When it comes to the question of the parking service, the housing service of parking, I think there's no question that she had a parking space, but it was unassigned at first. There were 21 units and 16 spaces, so my thinking is that the value of a space that's unassigned, that's just, the possibility of having a space available would be on the lower scale. However, I don't know if we have precedent there. It doesn't look like the discussion on page 37 talks about a different valuation of assigned versus unassigned. If there wasn't a precedent, I'd say maybe $75 because it seems like a lot less value for just maybe you'll get a spot, maybe you weren't. And other than that, I would agree with everything that the hearing examiner decided.
I would, I'll be voting to affirm the hearing examiner's decision, but just a couple of comments on page 13, and the council made reference several times to they currently have no car. That's totally irrelevant. Whether they have a car, they don't have a car, they have a parking space. I have neighbors who drove for many years. They're now at an age where they can't drive. They still have their parking space for when their daughter and grandson come. So whether you own a car, lease a car, don't have a car, parking space is parking space. So whether they don't have a car is completely irrelevant. And I was disturbed by, on page 37 of our record, that David said they should be willing to give up their parking space, show that they are serious about cooperating. I'm not a criminal defense lawyer, but that sounds to me like extortion. Either you sign this and give up your parking space, or you're not serious about whatever the issues were. So I just found that to be fairly reprehensible behavior on the part of the management team for that property. So I will be voting in favor of affirming the hearing examiner's decision. Thank you.
I have a question for staff, first of all. It's my understanding that it's as of a certain date, and I don't know what date that is, but in the last 10 years or so, the city has made it illegal to remove a parking spot from a tenant. I know that that's not not the housing department's probably a requirement to enforce, but do we share that information? Like when this information comes to the counter, do we either inform the tenant that they should report it to code enforcement, or do we share that information at all? Or
That's something internally that we would do depending on the facts and circumstances of a case, whether we would refer that out for, because it would be a criminal prosecution.
Okay, thank you. In terms of my comments for this, I do also agree that the record indicates that the lease is the 2001 lease amount, and that should be the starting base of the MAR. And since there was not a registration form, I agree with the hearing examiner in that area. I think I understand your point about the value of the parking versus someone having an unassigned space, one of 16 spots versus a specific spot, and you're suggesting that it could fall in the lesser of the spectrum than the higher. I would entertain that but then we get complicated where it was actually assigned later. If a service is increased over time, there's no going back really, because I think we've had that case like with the cable in one of our buildings that they were going to add something then take it away. So actually, now that I've been thinking about it out loud, probably would not agree with that in this case, because I think that the value was at the amount that the hearing examiner rate that she gave it, did value it at the parking, defined parking spot. So I think I would proceed with supporting the hearing examiner's decision in this case.
Commissioner Gregoire?
You know, I have to say the testimony tonight really confused me, but look, I think this is actually a pretty simple case. I don't want to repeat what everyone else has said. The reality is, at some point in the history of this tenancy, these folks did have a parking spot available to them, and that is the only relevant fact to us tonight. You know, once that spot was available to those tenants, it was theirs, and you know, it can't be taken away without a corresponding rent reduction. So I support staff's recommendation tonight to affirm the hearing examiner's decision.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to quick comments, a couple of them. Two issues before us, of course, parking separate from the determination of the MAR, maximum adjusted rent. I don't see how we can connect them together. They are so separate from each other, and I agree with Vice Chair Gregoire statement that the landlord's representative provided kind of a conflicting or information, confusing us. But once we separate these two issues, there is no confusion. The fact remains that it's undisputed that the parking service was provided at the time of renting, at the time of renting the unit in 2001. So that was a service, a landlord-provided housing service, although there was not a signed rental agreement, or there was a signed, it is irrelevant. Whatever was available to the tenant at the time of renting, that becomes a housing service provided by the landlord, included in the rent. So later on, subsequent rental agreements will not change the initial term of the rental term. So therefore, the parking shall remain as a housing service. I want to also mention that in West Hollywood would take reduction of parking services issues very seriously, and that's why the City Council several years ago amended the RSO the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, to include a specific provision that the parking space is a inseparable part of the rental unit in the City of Los Angeles and cannot be removed. So therefore, there is no doubt in my mind that the service was provided at the time of renting and shall remain as a housing service included in the rent. And I agree with the examiner's determination on the MAR. We have to go back to the to the amount of $700 at the time of renting, and there is no other way around about it. So it has to be based on the registration form. And with that said, I'm prepared to support the staff's recommendation in this matter.
And I'm also in agreement with my fellow commissioners. I do realize the appealing party was asking us for a settlement of sorts, but the reason this is so clear to us is because it's simply clear in the West Hollywood Municipal Code and the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, and Commissioner Gregoire laid it out very black and white, that there was a housing service that was reduced, and I saw the MAR to be calculated in accordance with the code. So if there are no further comments at this point, yes, Commissioner O'Keefe.
I might have misunderstood. It sounds like Commissioner Kirpies and I have a different understanding of what the ruling on the housing service is, so I just want to make sure I'm completely clear. What was removed is unassigned parking, in other words, what the lease itself said in 2001, in your legal opinion, or was it the brief period of time when there was assigned parking? Is that what was?
The examiner found that the assigned covered parking space had been removed. That was the finding. The valuation doesn't depend on whether it was assigned or unassigned. It depends on whether it's covered, secured, et cetera. But the findings of the hearing examiner were such that she was convinced that the parking as of the hearing date had been assigned.
Okay.
And I just want to add, not so brief. I mean, even the new lease that recognizes the parking space was 2012, so we're talking about a significant period of years.
And I was saying that I had this just been an open spot that they every night when they come home from work they take their chance at getting finding a spot. I would say that values less than an assigned spot. However, whether it was a month or 6 years or whatever, at some point they had a service that I would say was less in value with the unassigned, and at one point they increased it to an assigned, which now I understand where the value came from, or I agree with the hearing examiner on what she valued it at, and then now it's just gone, whatever of that situation. But at one point it raised its value by that's the service that they offered. And so that's where I was kind of, when I was talking out loud and kind of walking through it, that's where I came down on.
And to clarify, because it looks undisputed in the record of the hearing that both parties, and what we heard today, both parties agree that initially it was unassigned. So you can have the landlord increase the value of it on their own, and that's what they are entitled to. Okay, understood.
At this time, do we have a motion?
I have a motion to make, Chair. A motion to adopt the resolution of the Rent Stabilization Commission of the City of West Hollywood affirming the hearing examiner's decision on application D-4332 that pertains to 1000 Palm Avenue, Unit 16.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Gregoire. At this time, we have a motion on the floor. Secretary Barrino, may we have a vote for this motion?
Commissioner Kirpies,
Aye.
Commissioner Bergstein,
Aye.
Commissioner O'Keefe,
Aye.
Commissioner Maggio, Commissioner Topchian,
Aye.
Vice Chair Gregoire,
Aye.
Chair Charity.
Aye. Thank you. The motion passes. Parties, if you have any questions, please stay after, and staff will help you with those questions. At this time, I'm going to take a quick pause and retrieve Commissioner Maggio so we can move on in the meeting.
I forgot I'd had that typo that I corrected in the resolution. Okay.
Okay, Commissioner Maggio has returned. Commissioner O'Keefe, you said there maybe was a typo in the resolution?
Yeah, I'd raised earlier that in the second paragraph of the summary, it says on-site covered parking. So I should have, before we voted, said we should approve the resolution as amended to say uncovered instead of covered.
Short clerk error. Thank you very much. At this time, we're moving on from item 9 to item 10, unfinished business. I don't believe we have any unfinished business on the commission. So we'll move on from item 10 to item 11, new business. The Rent Stabilization Commission will consider forming a subcommittee to study the unit re-registration process. Do we have a staff report for this item, or just a discussion?
No staff report, it's a discussion, and if the commission would put forth a motion and take a vote.
Some water.
This
Suggested this?
well,
Somebody could-
technically, it was.
I would yield to Commissioner Kirby.
Thank you. So this came out of the conversation that we had a couple meetings ago about a concern, asking staff to come back with a report and a broad report about how the rent stabilization ordinance, the requirement of re-registration, the importance of that, the significance of it, each step of the way, and what alternatives we might want to look at. But after speaking with staff and kind of digesting that information a little bit more, their suggestion was that maybe we form a subcommittee to review this, get an understanding of it, and then, if necessary, could report back to the commission in a little bit more organized, more thought out way, so that they're not prepping a whole lot, having this huge presentation, and then maybe we do something, or maybe we just go in some awkward direction that they weren't expecting. and then we ultimately don't want to do because we've only heard about it that night.
And just to refresh us all, is this because of the concern that maybe there are too many people missing their re-registration forms, and we're seeing a lot of MAR cases? Is that where, just getting a background about where it's kind of coming from? Are we concerned as a commission that we're seeing our landlords miss the re-registration process?
I think it was a combination, but I'll let others speak that maybe expressed a concern. I think the case in front of us that night was just one of those that was unique in a way that there seemed to be a lot of, to some of us, it seemed that it seemed like there was a lot done in terms of the process had been followed with the exception of the registration, but all dialogue between the tenant and landlord were consistent with what we expect and want, and that was what brought it, what elevated it to my attention. But I'll let others speak.
So this was triggered by that one case we had recently, right? A few meetings ago.
Yeah, is this the cases where we had two MAR cases in one night? One was one where they lost the application, and one was we had found the application stamped, but it wasn't recognized by the city of West Hollywood until our evaluation here.
And that was the only case, as far as I remember, being here for 12 years already. I don't recall anything similar to that happened before. So I don't know if we have to, form a subcommittee and start working, changing things just based on the one.
But remember, we're not talking about changing anything. We're talking about subcommittees. So we don't want to get too far into the dialogue about whether we should or shouldn't change something. We're just talking about whether we should have a subcommittee on it. Or the alternative is, if we don't pass this tonight, the motion was already to have staff come back and give a larger presentation. So,
as part of the subcommittee, and this is a question for the commission and staff, would the subcommittee, obviously, I think we're just looking to learn more about the re-registration process. As part of the subcommittee work, would there be a staff member willing to walk us through how the process works? Would we be able to? Because I obviously don't know the inner workings of, how the landlords are contacted, or who contacts who, or where the paperwork actually sits. So is that something that you would be interested in, or having staff walk us through this process?
I think if you all decide to form a subcommittee to look at this more closely, staff would work with the subcommittee. I think that's the idea. As Commissioner Kirby suggested, if the subcommittee finds out more information and then decides there really is no reason to take it any further, that's where it would end.
But we could at least, present some report of what the subcommittee found, and
If the subcommittee wants to do that, absolutely. Similar to
at a future meeting, we could do that.
Similar to the smoking subcommittee that was formed. Sure.
So here's my question. And maybe it's premature, but I know that Mr. Noonan's been working on kind of, I call it the super database, where everything will be electronic down at City Hall, and you'll be able to do a printout of apartment building 1,200 Flores or whatever. This is the last time each of these apartments was last registered upon new vacancies. Send that form off to landlords. So I think that once that is in place, that may end up negating a lot of these. I hope a lot of these cases where a landlord finds out they never re-registered the unit. So the question then for me would be, is the tenant entitled to a reduction, to a not a reduction, a refund in overcharge and rent because that form had not been formed, so had not been filed. So I'm not sure if I'd want to wait until that database was complete and staff has decided how they want to handle those situations, or if it's better that we have that conversation first and then give our thoughts to staff to incorporate in for when that process occurs.
I like the idea to.
So,
I like the idea to wait until to see if they maybe staff can tell us, or Manager Noonan, when we expect or anticipate some changes or some usage of a database for.
So our database upgrade was needed because our software was out of date and was soon going to be so obsolete that it would no longer be supported on the by the software of the company that wrote it. So the contract that we have and the work that we're doing is to update our current software. We're not changing our process. We are, except that we are going online with the process. And I think that that in and of itself is going to create and it's going to close a lot of these gaps or concerns or issues, because what I'm hearing tonight is that there is a concern over what happens with the form when it comes into our office and it doesn't end up in our database. And then at some point later, it shows up in front of you with a date stamp from the city, which I think is what happened at that, I believe it was the August 9th meeting. So what we are doing is closing that gap. And I'm more than happy. I'd really like to start, we're almost at a point where I can start sharing that, in my updates to the commission, to share with you and to assure you that that is being addressed. We are addressing, or we're creating in this, the capacity as well for the landlord actually to just go online through a portal and access their information. Because right now, it's more of a physical. You have to come in, submit a public records request, you look at the physical file. We're changing that so that the landlord will be issued a PIN from the managing software consultant company, HDL. They will have access to their files. They'll be registering online. They'll be able to also check and see when their last registrations were in. But outside of these changes, which honestly, I don't want to downplay them, they are quite substantial. I've been speaking with my staff regularly about this, because when we put this into place, it will be a real sea change in how we approach this, since we are paper-based. I believe all other programs right now are either going digital or digital in their registrations. But we're ultimately not changing other aspects of it. What I'm hearing tonight is a desire to look at the legal aspects, and that's not part of what staff is doing now.
So I'm a little confused. I know we had very specific conversations with you last year when you started talking about the new software, the new databases, and at that point, you'd assured me that once the database was, the software was completed, information was input, that you would be notifying, not that the landlord would have to go online, but the city would be notifying the landlords, this is when your last registrations were. It sounds like you're now
That's
saying...
in the billing process, and I apologize. And I apologize for also cutting you off. I hope that you don't mind.
Okay.
Because I just wanted to correct it real quick. I know what you're talking about. And yes, you're right, and we're planning that as part of the billing, that the billing that goes out lists the registered tenancies, the dates of that. So that's all part of each year at the billing site, the landlord receives a bill, and the bill doesn't list the registered tenancies on it. We're adding that to the bill, so they will see their last registered tenancies. Ultimately, these are flags, but we will never be able to replace good record keeping. on the landlord's side. However, if a landlord does have a registration, it's stamped, it's, that they have their copy, or in this case, what they'll have is an email. If they submit a registration online, they're going to get an email back recording that the city's received their registration. They keep that. If there's ever an issue or a dispute, they have that record that we've received the file.
Thank you.
You bet.
Just to refresh on what brought about this whole conversation, there were two different cases that night. One of them was the one with the date stamp, which I don't think matched the date that was on it, which was a little strange. And then there was another case where there was a filled out form, but it had not ever been stamped. So in that case, the landlord and tenant had both signed it. There was just a question of whether or not it was filed, and we acted as if it wasn't. So both of those to me caused some concern of that. I thought maybe there was an inequitable result. Personally, I don't know if I think that there's a subcommittee needed on the specific question of re-registration. I'm interested in hearing about the whole process as a whole, as a body. If 3 members of the committee or however many wanted to serve on a subcommittee, I don't think I'd object to it. But I personally have interest in looking into a couple of related issues. I understand before I was in this commission, there was approval of asking for a waiver period so that all of these unregistered units could get into compliance and get registered without having to pay what they otherwise would have to pay for not having been registered. And just sitting on this commission for a few months, it seems like that happens sometimes, that there's just never been a registration, there's a turnover in ownership, and if we want everybody in the system, a waiver seems like a reasonable idea, and I'm not sure where that stands, but this is a little off field from that, but those are my areas of interest of looking at what how far the look back period should be in different cases, if there was a way to vary it.
Based on the comments, I really like to hear what the legal counsel has to say.
Well, I don't want to get too far into that, but we did look at this, and that's not a possibility. As I explained, I believe it was last year or maybe even a year and a half ago. State law governs this, and the city has, being consistent with state law, if the unit is not re-registered, since this is the only way that a rent-stabilized city knows when a new tenant has come in, there are consequences to failing to re-register. And so in that context, a waiver is just not a possibility.
Could you expand on that a little further? Because I know we can choose to have it be a 3-year look back, which it is now once the person...
So that's different. So originally, the consequences are you're ineligible to apply the annual general adjustment. So if someone moved in 2001 and their unit was not re-registered until 2018, from 2001 to 2018, all of those AGAs were illegally imposed. And the tenant normally would be entitled to all of that money back. What the city has decided to do, instead of refunding all of that amount, we've limited that amount to the most recent 3 years. That's very different from what was proposed last year, which is was some kind of a waiver. If they get it in within 6 months, then all of those AGAs will no longer be illegal. That's not something that the law allows.
Could we not just repeal the penalty entirely for 6 months if we wanted to, or something like that, and then said if you file it, then there is no penalty, and that's essentially has the same effect if people can file their re-registration? There's no creative way around it?
No.
I think these are kind of like some of the questions that would be really good in the subcommittee to figure out, because we all kind of have these ideas of, oh, well, maybe we could do it this way, or maybe we could do it that way. And I think that the point of this subcommittee was so that instead of all of us up here just asking random questions that pop into our head about, well, maybe we go this direction, or why can't we do that, and make it almost impossible for our staff to be able to do a full presentation and us get the full understanding of it in one night, that we take it into a subcommittee. The folks who want to look closer into this and have these ideas can then discuss it with staff, and we can go back and forth, and we can fully understand why it is we can't, or staff will look at something and say, you know what, we might, and then they can let us know, and then if there's something that comes out of this committee, we could come back.
Chair, but based on what we already heard from the legal counsel's explanation, that type of review or change, or I'm not talking about the change, but the suggestion that we have to have a waiver or anything like that, that undermines the whole purpose of the RSO, as it was explained. We have to always go back to what was the intention, what was the purpose. The sole purpose of the ordinance was to be able to control that rent. And without re-registering procedure, the city cannot do it. That's the whole idea. So now by implementing or suggesting any waiver or anything like that, that's going to undermine the entire RSO. That's why I don't really see what is the purpose of forming the commission, a subcommittee to look into that matter, that we know that is not a possibility. And yeah, it was already explained, so that the 3-year statute of limitation was already applied, implemented. So we're not going back to 20 years ago and asking the landlord to reimburse the overpayments for overcharges for 20 years. So we'll only do for a 3-year period. But the waiver, it's not possible. I don't see how it's going to work.
I think the heart of the purpose of the RSO is to maintain rent-stabilized housing in our city. And so my concern is if, on those 2 cases we saw, one of them raised rents by far, far, far less than they legally would have been able to if they'd filed this piece of paper. It was something like 5 out of the 15 years they'd taken a rent increase, and each of those increases were within the amount that would have otherwise been allowed. So my concern is if there are landlords that might have not filed some paperwork for years and years and years, well, that's a problem. If the heart of providing affordable housing and not increasing it has happened for years, then you have a transfer property. My concern is it's possible, especially when we have very high fees that are coming in for seismic retrofit, and already the permissible rent increases is a little bit less than inflation every year, that you might have an incentive for people to elicit out. So the heart of what we're doing, I think, is we want to try to keep affordable housing, and if we have results that end up with very hefty penalties for something that's just, in the one case we saw, they did the heart of it. They signed the paper, they gave the tenant the paper, so everybody had the notice. There was just the question of whether or not it was filed. So in my mind, it's worth exploring. Is there a way, and is there a way to get everybody in the system who's not yet? But in any case, the way this was framed was a study of the re-registration processing, and my questions would be broader, that I'd be interested in looking at not just the processing, but the whole, the waiver and exploring, and maybe there's no way around it, but I know that before I was on this body, the body was interested in it.
And if I may, just move this along, I know that the subcommittee seems to have the agenda of fact-finding, both process and legal. I have no problem with a subcommittee that's interested in exploring the process of re-registration and the legal boundaries, that surround the issue. I don't know if any commissioners would have a problem with that, but I guess my question is, if we're looking at a fact-finding subcommittee for looking at the re-registration process and the, legal boundaries of it and what, can be done or can't be done, do we have enough commissioners that are interested in being on this subcommittee even before we're looking at forming one? Do we have, okay, so.
If it's broad, I would be.
Yeah, and 2 is enough, correct? Staff, 2 is enough for a subcommittee?
I think so.
Yeah, I believe so as
It
well.
just has to be less than 4. Less than a quorum, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just, curious if we, I realize that some commissioners, may see that they find nothing, but if they find nothing, then at least we've allowed our fellow commissioners to fact find and report back to us what, they were factually able to find. And I have no problem with learning more about, the boundaries of our law and the processes of our city.
And I don't really see the need for the subcommittee, but we have at least 2 commissioners who are interested in learning more about it. So I'm not going to stand in the way. I'll support a motion to create a subcommittee to help commissioners who are interested explore this issue a little more.
I'll second the motion.
Well, I wasn't making a motion.
Yes, you were.
I was not making the motion. I'm not going to stand in the way of a motion. I will vote yes.
It is a question. I mean, I don't see this necessary to be especially since it is so narrow in scope, to be just a standing subcommittee. I think there should be an ad hoc committee with just a limited 3-month, 6-month, whatever you feel appropriate. I don't think it's a lot of separate meetings with staff. I think it's probably one or two kind of in-depth meetings and maybe like some conversations on the phone. So I don't think it needs to last forever. I think that there should be a time limit put on it and that we come back with whatever it is that.
I don't think we have to worry about the time limit, but if somebody wants to propose that. And somebody needs to make the motion, because I'm not willing to make that
I'll
motion.
make a motion that we create a subcommittee or an ad hoc committee, the Rent Stabilization Commission, focusing on the unit re-registration process. And I'll just leave it at that, because I think that is pretty broad from start to finish.
As long as we agree that it encompasses that, yes.
And the two members will be Commissioner Kirpies and Commissioner O'Keefe.
No one else wants to join, right?
Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you. So we do have a motion on the table. Secretary Barino, may we have a vote?
Commissioner Kirpies,
Aye.
Commissioner Bergstein,
Aye.
Commissioner O'Keefe,
Aye.
Commissioner Maggio,
Aye.
Commissioner Topchian,
No.
Vice Chair Gregor,
Aye.
Chair Charity.
Aye. Thank you. So the motion passes. We have formed an ad hoc subcommittee. Thank you, commissioners, for that discussion. We will move on from item 11, new business, to item 12, public comment, which I don't believe we have any public comment, correct? Okay. Then we'll move on from item 12 to item 13, commission comments. Commissioner Bergstein?
I had a couple more. I just wanted to sneak that one in earlier while Esther was still here. One, just prior to this meeting, I attended the Apartment Owners Association of Los Angeles is reforming a West Hollywood chapter, and I was able to sit in for a few minutes and encourage landlords to feel free to come to our commission and speak during public comment. It said that we cannot talk about specific issues, can't respond to what they talk about during public comment, but it would be nice to have some landlords come and voice their opinions and thoughts from time to time. Secondly, I have an article I'll give to staff to copy. I don't know how similar the rent control laws are in New York City to West Hollywood. It was interesting. They have a law where if a property owner receives tax credits, and they want to undergo major renovations, they have to notify the city which units are rent stabilized. Evidently, not every unit and every building is rent controlled, rent stabilized, and they were able to track, I think, 9,000 units, including quite a number that were owned by the Kushners that had not units. So just an interesting article. I'll pass it to staff at the end if we can copy that for the commissioners at the next meeting. Thank you.
Any further commission comments? No? I don't have any comments. Moving on from item 13 to item 14, staff comments. I don't believe we have any, but if we do, no? Okay.
A couple.
Thank you.
A couple. Thank you. I did want to make a general announcement and invite you all on Wednesday, October 24th, the Disabilities Advisory Board is presenting the 20th Annual Disability Service Awards. This is part of the city's observance of Disability Awareness Month. It will be held here in City Council Chambers, 625 North San Vicente at 6 p.m. That's 6 p.m. on Wednesday, October 24th. Also, I wanted to mention to the commission that at the upcoming council meeting, incentives for multifamily historic resources is coming forward. That's a report that's being put forth by the Planning and Development Services Department. Commissioner Gregoire, or Vice Chair Gregoire, was on a subcommittee. I believe that Commissioner Josh Kirpies was also on a subcommittee at the time. This was back, I believe, in 2015, 2014, in fact, maybe even 2013, where a number of incentives were being looked at to encourage rehabilitation of older historic apartment buildings, and these are rent-stabilized apartment buildings. One of the items that had come forward was a recommendation to reconsider to consider a specific program in the RSO. And so one of the recommendations on that report is to modify the rent stabilization ordinance to allow an alternative plan to replace the required painting schedule for designated historic properties. So what this is addressing is to allow an alternative painting plan and program for those buildings that potentially could have appliques on the walls, could have historic finishes or features. As remember right now on the interior, repainting is required every 4 years. On the exterior, it's every 7. And so the concern here that's come up on historic resources is that the painting may be too much and may in fact be damaging some of those surfaces. So if this in fact goes forward and the council does so direct, that item will come back to the commission to consider. That
Thank you.
concludes
Do
my
we have any-
comments.
Thank you. Do we have any commission comments or questions for staff? Okay, then the business of this meeting is concluded. The next meeting of the Rent Stabilization Commission will be held October 11th, 2018 at the West Hollywood Park Public Meeting Room, Council Chamber. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.